Story 1 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story 1. The Strange Story of Major Weir. The craze for supplanting old things with new is responsible for much vandalism. While the modern besom of reform has swept away some of the most picturesque buildings in all our large cities, even the eerie things that stalked the land during the hours of darkness, and only fled back to their abodes of gloom and mystery as the cocks crew and the glimmering dawn began to assert itself, have been exorcised from their accustomed haunts by the joiner's saw and the bricklayer's trowel, and many a once familiar spirit that made our grandparents' flesh creep is known no more. Nothing, perhaps, that ever came from the unseen world was better known up to 1878 than the ghosts of the terrible Major Weir and his awful sister Grizel. For over 200 years they haunted, to the terror of the neighbourhood, the scenes so familiar to them while on earth, and there was hardly an inhabitant of the region around the historical West Bow in Edinburgh who had not at some time or other seen the ghosts of the wicked Major or his infamous sister. The dark and grim alley that led to the house so long the residence of the Major and Grizel when they were in the flesh was passed with a shudder. Boys and girls avoided it as they would a nest of serpents, and when darkness had fallen, the man or woman was hardly to be found who would have ventured down that accursed passage. For strange apparitions, like black and silent shadows, flitted about, and though the Major's house had long been tenantless, for no one could be induced to live in such a place, unearthly noises echoed through its decaying chambers at night, and lights that came from no earthly gas or candles gleamed from the begrimed windows. And sometimes, when a belated traveller, nervously wending his way homeward, passed the haunted alley, he has been suddenly almost turned to stone with horror by observing a headless coal-black horse of gigantic proportions, with blood and fire streaming from its neck, issue forth, ridden by the grinning spectre of Major Weir, though in a few moments horse and rider would suddenly vanish in a whirlwind of blue flame. Anything more frightful than this apparition could not be imagined, and yet it was by no means uncommon, and sometimes the inhabitants of the Bow, when peacefully sleeping in their beds, were aroused by the thundering of a ponderous coach drawn by 6 fiery steeds at full gallop. It came up the Lawn Market, shook the very foundations of the solid houses in the Bow as it tore along to the head of the terrible close, as alleys are called in Scotland, where it paused for a few minutes, and then thundered back again, leaving behind it sheets of flame and an overpowering smell of sulphur. Strange as it may sound now, this equipage was driven by the Evil One himself, who came to take back the Major and his sister after they had spent a night's leave of absence in their former earthly abode. All this changed, however, for in 1878 the Improvement Commission of Edinburgh, with ruthless hand, improved the Major's house and the dreadful close off the face of the earth for ever, and the disgusted ghosts walked no more. But who was Major Weir, some may ask? Well, he was a native of Kirktown, in Lanarkshire, and was born about the beginning of the 16th century. His mother was a sorceress of great repute, and it was only natural she should, at an early stage of his career, initiate her son into the mysteries of the black art. This did not prevent him, however, from becoming a soldier, for in 1641 we find he was a lieutenant in the Scottish army that was sent by the Covenanters to Ireland to protect the Ulster settlers. In this capacity he saw considerable service, being present at the storming of Carrickfergus and the sanguinary battle of Benburb. During this battle he was furiously attacked by a native armed with a formidable pike, with which he made a tremendous lunge at his foe, but at that moment a great black hand came out of space, seized the pike and hurled it away, and so startled was the native by this remarkable apparition that he fell down in a fit and expired. For his Irish services Weir received promotion, and became a major. Soon afterwards he was appointed to the command of the Guard of Edinburgh, and in that capacity he had charge of the military arrangements during the execution of the great Montrose. He was a striking-looking man, powerfully built, and had a massive, sullen, repellent sort of face. His eyes were small, but burned like jets of fire, while his hair was coal-black. On being appointed to his command in Edinburgh, he took up his lodgings in the house in the West Bow, and that house was destined to bear the most evil of reputations ever after. His sister Grizel, as remarkable-looking a woman as he was a man, came to reside with him, and this strange couple began then to hold direct intercourse with the Prince of Darkness, who presented the Major with an ebony staff that bestowed upon its possessor extraordinary powers of eloquence. The night on which the unholy one and Major Weir made their compact in the Major's house, the elements were disturbed in such a manner that the oldest inhabitant could remember nothing like it. An intense gloom enveloped the city, and from out the piled-up masses of clouds there suddenly leapt sheets of flame, followed by peals of thunder that shook the solid earth and caused many women and children to die of fright. Then ensued a deluge of rain that flooded the streets and drowned hundreds of cattle and sheep grazing in the fields. Many houses were struck by lightning, as well as people, and the destruction and distress caused by this most awful storm were tremendous. During the time that the storm was at its height, a strange little old man, enveloped in a large black cloak, appeared in the Major's room. Where he came from, or how he got in it, is impossible to say. It is equally impossible to tell precisely what passed between this little old man, who announced himself as the Prince of Darkness, and the Major and his sister. But this much at least is known, that the Prince handed the Major an ebony staff, telling him that slave never obeyed his master so well as that staff would obey him. It would fetch and carry, confer upon him extraordinary eloquence, and render him invulnerable to everything except a single burn. The Prince advised the Major to devote himself to praying and expounding, as that would give him great influence with the people, and was the surest way to worldly advancement. Accordingly, we find it stated in Fraser's MS., in the Advocate's Library at Edinburgh, that he, Weir, became so notoriously regarded among the Presbyterian sect that if four met together, be sure that Major Weir was one. At private meetings he prayed to admiration, which made many of that stamp court his converse. He never married, but lived in a private house with his sister Grizel Weir. Many resorted to his house to join with him and to hear him pray. But it was observed that he could not officiate in any holy duty without the black staff or rod in his hand and leaning upon it, which made those who heard him pray admire his power of prayer, his ready extemporary expression, his heavenly gesture, so that he was thought more an angel than a man, and was termed by some of the holy sisters ordinarily Angelical Thomas. In spite, however, of this outward show of sanctity, the Major was engaged in wizardry that was truly astonishing, while his inner life was darkened by crimes of the most repulsive kind. On one occasion, having conceived a dislike to two of his neighbors, a man and woman who had given him some offense, he invited them to supper. During the meal he summoned his master the devil, who appeared in his most horrifying aspect. When the guests saw this frightful apparition, they both went raving mad, and Satan then touched them on the forehead and killed them. Where he touched them was a large blue mark, and as soon as they were dead he whisked them through the window and laid them side by side at the top of the close, where they were found next morning. The discovery caused great consternation in the Bow, and the strange blue mark on the forehead of each corpse convinced people that something uncanny had caused their death, though what that was never known until the terrible Major himself confessed years afterwards. At length, however, retribution was to overtake this very wicked man and his equally wicked sister. After a long course of iniquity, and when he was verging on 70 years of age, the Major fell seriously ill. This illness had such an effect upon his mind that he made open confession of his wickedness and of his compact with the fiend. So astounding and seemingly incredible was the story he told that Sir Andrew Ramsay of Abbotshall, who was Lord Provost of Edinburgh from 1662 to 1673, refused at first to order his arrest. But to such a pitch of furiousness rose the outcry against the wizard and his sister that at last the provost had them conveyed to the toll booth, together with the magic ebony staff. One of the bailies was then sent to search the major's house, and amongst other things he found a quantity of money wrapped up in pieces of cloth. A scrap of this cloth was inadvertently cast on the fire, when it caused a tremendous report that was heard all over the bow. The money was taken by the magistrate to his own house, but no sooner had he arrived than the pieces flew out of the bag in which they were being carried, and banged themselves about, smashing windows and furniture to fragments, and it was only when the baillie and his appalled family offered up a prayer that the demoniacal money flew up the chimney and was seen no more. While lying in prison, waiting to be tried, the major seems to have become still more conscience-stricken, so that he made the most astounding revelations, and the sensation these revelations caused throughout Edinburgh was immense. People could hardly believe that such things could be possible. Of course, the confession only served to seal his doom still more surely, and when, on April 9th, 1670, he was brought before the Justiciary Court, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. He and his sister, however, were duly tried, and the major was sentenced to be strangled and burned between Edinburgh and Leith, while Grizel was to be hanged in the Grassmarket. As soon as he was conveyed back to prison, he was earnestly urged to pray to heaven for pardon. But according to Law's Memorials, he exclaimed, "Torment me no more. I am tormented enough already." He strenuously declined to see a clergyman. In due course he was brought out for execution, and as he was placed over the fire with the rope around his neck, some pious people urged him to say, "Lord, be merciful to me." But he replied fiercely, "Let me alone. I will not say anything of the kind. I have lived as a beast and must die like a beast." As soon as he had been strangled, his body was cast into the fire along with his ebony staff, and the horror and amazement of the spectators may be imagined when they saw this remarkable staff twist and turn about and perform the most extraordinary contortions, and all the time uttering strange sounds. Nor did it disappear until the last vestige of the major's body had been consumed. Though even then the stick was not burnt, but it leapt high up above the flames and vanished from the sight of the appalled spectators. As soon as the major had been disposed of, his sister was prepared for execution. But when told of her brother's death, she fell to raving in the most horrible manner, and she vowed that not only was she a sorceress, but that her mother before her had been a witch. She also declared that she and her brother had been in direct communication with the devil, who, on one occasion, had taken them for a drive in a fiery chariot drawn by headless horses, and in broad daylight. As soon as she was brought to the place of execution, she began rending her clothes, saying that she wanted to die with all the shame she could. Like her brother, she refused to pray, and scoffed at those who tried to induce her to repent. Let it not be supposed, however, that although the woman had been strangled, and the man strangled and burnt, that these people had been got rid of. Oh dear, no! For the very night following their execution, the major's house was observed to be brilliantly lighted up. From every window light gleamed, and such light too, utterly unlike anything the citizens were accustomed to. But this was not all, for from the house issued roars of laughter, eldritch screams, and wild shouts of revel. All night long the inhabitants of the Bow heard the thunder of invisible chariot wheels either going to or coming from the major's house, and now and again great sheets of blue flame shot out of the grim close that gave access to the major's door. These revels were kept up till daylight began to dawn, and then the frightened neighbors saw that the lights in the house faded out, and the shouts of the revellers were hushed. A few nights later a woman was proceeding through the Bow carrying a lantern. She was going to visit a sick neighbor, and had a little basket on her arm filled with delicacies. As she reached the top of the dreaded close, her basket and lantern were whisked away from her, and then she was frozen with horror, as she beheld standing in the mouth of the close the well-known form of Grizel Weir. She appeared, however, to be of enormous stature, and was grinning horribly. This dreadful sight caused the poor woman to fall down in a fit, and she was found some time later and conveyed to her home. But when she recovered from the fit, she related all that she had seen, and soon after she lost her reason owing to the shock she had received. For a week or two after this, nothing was observed either in the close or the Major's house, which was shunned by everyone. But at last one night the neighbours heard a sound as of some tremendous body rushing through the air. On looking out of their windows, they beheld a gigantic black horse bearing on its back Major Weir. The animal's eyes were great balls of fire, and fire streamed from its nostrils. On reaching the close, this mysterious steed stopped, and the Major alighted, and instantly the close was filled with strange beings, each one carrying a torch, while a wild shout greeted the Major's arrival. Then once more was the house illuminated from top to bottom, and presently, to the horror of those who were witnesses of this remarkable occurrence, a window in the Major's house was opened, and a headless body was flung out and alighted with a sickening thud on the pavement. 5 minutes later, from another window, a head was flung after the body, and all night long these ghastly objects lay on the pavement, for no one who had witnessed the sickening sight dared to leave his house. When the day dawned, however, people hurried down and informed the authorities of what they had seen. The head and the body were at once secured, but who the person was, no one of the many hundreds of people who saw the remains was able to recognize. The head had been cut off so evenly that there was not a jag to be seen. No sooner had the citizens recovered from this horror before a fresh one was in store for them. Again one night unearthly sounds were heard. There was laughter such as no mortal ever uttered, and shrill screams that human throats were incapable of. And when the scared neighbours ventured to peer out, they saw that every window of the Major's house was wide open, and at each window was a grinning skeleton, the eyeless sockets being filled with balls of blue flame. The whole thing was hideous and appalling, and no wonder that some of those that were eyewitnesses lost their reason. But probably the most appalling sight of all was that which was witnessed by Mistress Margaret Donaldson and her maid. This good lady was of exceeding piety, and had great renown for truthfulness, while her maid was a most virtuous woman, and had been in Mistress Donaldson's service for over 20 years. The lady was a widow, very comely, and much sought after by the beaux of the period. Her husband had been a barber and a very industrious man, and having accumulated some money, he was enabled to leave his widow very comfortably off. And as it was believed it was her money, and not herself, that was sought after, she turned a deaf ear to her many sighing suitors, and resolved to keep the memory of her departed green. Now it happened that Mistress Donaldson had a very intimate friend in the person of Mistress Williamson, also a widow, who resided in the Bow, and not very far from the haunted house of Major Weir. One afternoon Mistress Williamson invited a few select friends, including Mistress Donaldson, to drink a dish of hot spiced ale and discuss the current topics of the day. Mistress Donaldson, accompanied by her maid Jessie, proceeded to her friend's house about 4 of the clock in the afternoon of a November day. The ladies enjoyed themselves for 2 or 3 hours with much gossip, and did not consume more than 3 dishes of ale each. About 7 of the clock Mistress Donaldson prepared to depart. At that time a thick mist enveloped the city, and a small rain was descending. The lady put on her pattens and wrapped her cloak about her, and then, preceded by Jessie, who carried the lantern, started for her home. Her route passed that grim and mysterious close which led to the Major's house. On reaching the head of the close, the frightened maid suddenly whispered to her mistress, "God guard us, for I declare this is Major Weir's close." She had scarcely spoken the words when she uttered a piercing scream and cried out, "Oh, oh, somebody has got hold of me!" Her mistress rebuked her for what she termed her frivolity, and told her that the small dish of beer with the few drops of brandy that she had partaken of before starting, to keep the fog from affecting her throat, must have gone to her head. But in a few moments the good lady herself cried out, "Losh me, if there isna a arm around my own waist!" Instantly the 2 women were whirled round and round in a mad gallop, and the maid's lantern went flying up through the air. Then they were both whirled at a giddy pace down the awful close. The door of the Major's house was flung open, and a great blaze of blinding light streamed forth. The unseen partners of the 2 women, who were now almost dead with fright, lifted them into the passage, and the door closed with a bang. Upstairs they were carried to the great room, which was illuminated as for a ball, and here, exhausted and frightened out of their wits, they sank down onto a stool. But now they were to behold the most appalling sight ever seen by human eyes. the door at the end of the room was suddenly opened with a clang, and Major Weir and his awful sister appeared, escorted by the Prince of Darkness, who bowed with great politeness to the maid and mistress. Following this strange trio trooped in 50 pairs of skeletons, arm in arm. Anything more ghastly than this little army of grinning, chapless skeletons could not be conceived by the brain of man. The luckless women seemed to turn to stone with horror, and yet though they were deadly cold, the perspiration streamed from them. At a given signal, the skeletons, together with the Major and his sister, arranged themselves for a minuet. Then strange and unearthly music struck up from some unseen orchestra, and the skeletons, having bowed to each other, began to dance, the Major and his sister leading the way. The rattling of the bones of these fleshless dancers was horrible, and made the blood of the women curdle in their veins. Presently the minuet ceased, and the dancers formed themselves for a reel. 2 skeletons, to the terror of the women, approached them, and seizing them round the waist, lifted them into the center of the room. Then the music struck up again, and the dance of death began. It was awful. Round and round the room flew the skeletons in one awful mad stampede, their bones rattling in time to the strange music, and their fleshless jaws clicking and snapping as if these tenants of the grave were roaring with laughter. The Major and his sister seemed to be everywhere. They whirled round and round like a maelstrom, and with amazing rapidity, while the Evil One sat on a high chair at the end of the room, and appeared to enjoy the spectacle. How long the infernal revels were kept up the unfortunate women could not say. All they knew was that quite suddenly the dancers stood stock still, the lights went out, the maid and her mistress were carried downstairs through the doorway along the close and deposited on the pavement, where they became unconscious through the shock they had received, and where they were found in the dawn by the watch. They were at once conveyed home, and poor Mrs. Donaldson took to her bed, for that awful scene had been too much for her. A raging fever ensued, and in a week she was dead, but before dying she gave to the clergyman who attended her a circumstantial account of the ghastly ball at which she had been present, and this account was corroborated in every detail by the maid. It is needless to say that after this Major Weir's house was more shunned than ever, and for 100 years it remained without an earthly tenant, though it was haunted all that time by the Major and his ghostly companions. At length the unfortunate owner, who had been unable to either let or sell his property, determined to try and obtain a tenant who might for a time sit rent-free, in order to break the fearful spell that had so long hung over the accursed place. At length such a tenant was found in one William Paulo and his wife. Paulo had been a soldier, and was a very wild, reckless, and somewhat dissipated man. He was wont to declare that he did not care for either man or devil, and the prospect of getting a house rent-free induced him to accept the owner's offer. When it had become known that at last a tenant had been found for the haunted house of Major Weir, the excitement in the town was immense, and Paulo was looked upon with extraordinary interest. At length he and his spouse removed to their new quarters, but their very first night's experience deterred them and everyone else from ever again making the experiment. The honest man and his wife had not been long in bed before a remarkable phosphorescent glow seemed to pervade the room, and a noise that had no counterpart in earthly noises fell on the affrighted ears of the new tenants. Then, with eyeballs almost starting from their heads with terror, they beheld a gigantic beast, having a resemblance in form to a calf, but without a head. This strange creature put its 2 forepaws on the stock of the bed and reared upright, in all its ghastly headlessness, great streams of blood spouting from its neck. The woman fainted, and the man was spellbound, but presently he was enabled to murmur a prayer for protection, and then the frightful and appalling vision vanished. Next day, as soon as ever it was light, the rash pair quitted the place, and no attempt was ever afterwards made to inhabit it. Footnote: Scotch readers will know that this is not fiction, and English ones may be told that it is absolutely true that for 150 years Major Weir's house remained tenantless save by its evil spirits, though over and over again it was offered to people for nothing. But a curse had fallen upon it, and nothing could remove that curse until at last the Improvement Commission rooted the place up, crop and stone, thus purging it from its evil reputation, and banishing forever the ghosts of the wicked Major Weir and his terrible sister. End of footnote. End of Story 1. Recorded by Colleen McMahon.
Story 2 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story 2. The White Witch of the River, a Clyde legend. Many, many years ago, long before Helensburgh on the River Clyde had grown into the important place that it is now, when in fact it was only a primitive fishing village, whose inhabitants knew little of the world beyond their own doors. There dwelt there an honest fisher lad named Robin Rennie. He had been a fisher all his days, as his father and grandfather had before him, and no more fearless boatman existed in that part of the country. He was of an adventurous turn of mind too, and had explored the lonely Loch Long, Loch Goil, the Gareloch, and the Holy Loch, which, as all travellers by the Clyde know, run north from the river, with the exception of the Holy Loch, which trends west and back into the mountains. Wild and mysterious were these regions in those days, for the iron horse had not broken the solitudes of mountain and moorland, where the lordly eagle still held sway, and the hill fox reared her cubs in peace. In fact, so wondrous wild the whole might seem, the scenery of a fairy dream. And many indeed were the strange stories that were told of beings, not of mortal mould, who roamed about in these mountain fastnesses. Robin in his wanderings had often seen some of these creatures, and at night, round the turf fire, when the wind whistled shrilly about the cottages with their thatched roofs, he was wont to tell eerie stories to his awestruck companions, who listened with open eyes and gaping mouths until their hair rose on end and the blood curdled in their veins. The simple folk, in fact, used to say that there was something uncanny about Robin himself, and it was a common belief that he had made some unholy compact with the evil spirits that haunted the lochs and the gloomy glens. One thing is certain: he would start off alone on the darkest night, and with his boat penetrate up one or other of the lochs, and would return when day broke with his boat laden with fish. Now, is it not certain that to do this he must have had supernatural aid? At least that is what the simple villagers thought and even said. Then again, he often journeyed to the wondrous wild Loch Long, and would sometimes be absent 2 and 3 days together. When he was asked how he found shelter during his absence in such an inhospitable place, he replied that he lived in the ruins of Carrick Castle. Well, indeed might his listeners shudder when they heard this, for no man residing in the neighbourhood would have had the hardihood to doubt that Carrick Castle was a haunt of ghouls and spirits. Loch Long runs for nearly 18 miles, trending north and east, but halfway it is joined by Loch Goil, which trends to the west, and Carrick Castle frowns on the gloomy loch from a lofty crag, and many a stirring scene of bloodshed has it witnessed. Loch Goil is merely a narrow arm of the sea, at its broadest point not exceeding a mile, while the rocky sides are rent with many a seam, and in places so steep as to be inaccessible, and the peaks that tower above reach at their highest points 2,000 to 2,500 feet. Midway up this rock-bound strip of water stands the castle, that in some far-off time must have been a place of immense strength, and was so in fact down to 1685, when a body of wild hill men, instigated by the personal enemies of the Marquis of Argyll, to whom the stronghold then belonged, swept down from the mountains when the place was undefended, and with fire and rams turned it into a blackened ruin, so that it was said when referring to the Argylls, "Their old castle Carrick is peeled to its walls, and fleshless things grin in its once lordly halls." Time dealt kindly with the ruin, clothing its blackened walls with ivy and lichen, but the raven and the night owl made it their abode, and strange spirits revelled there, Yet to this place Robin Rennie was in the habit of going, and passing 2 or 3 days at a time. And it was whispered that it was in this ghostly ruin he had made his fearsome compact, whereby he was enabled to fill his boat with fish when other fishers were afraid to put to sea. What the compact stipulated he should give in return for this privilege was not stated. Rennie had the reputation of being well off, and he was the sole support of his widowed mother and a crippled brother. He had built a neat cottage that stood facing the river, and was the best cottage in all the village. He was a fine, stalwart young man, and not bad looking, although he had such a peculiar expression about his steel-grey eyes that some folk shunned him as being possessed of the evil eye. Notwithstanding the reputation he had thus acquired, there were plenty of girls in the village who would have jumped at him, had he but given them the slightest encouragement. But strange to say, he seemed to shun all female society, though there were those in the village who were ready to affirm most solemnly that they had seen him occasionally in the gloaming seated in his boat, accompanied by a most beautiful woman, dressed all in white, who was known as the White Witch of the river. She was a being of radiant beauty, with hair like a raven's plume, and a form of faultless mould, while her eyes shone like gleaming gold, and with a voice that was low and sweet, she could lure men to her feet, unless they turned their eyes to heaven and uttered a prayer. It was fatal to hear this siren singing, as she often did when the gloaming had enfolded the hills in purple shadows, or the pale moon made a silvery track on the river. Often at such a time the marvellous creature was seen gliding down the river, like a mist wreath from off the hillside. But those who saw her would instantly avert their gaze and hurry away, lest with her flute-like voice she should lure them to destruction. And yet, although it was known that the White Witch of the river fascinated men to follow her, in order to drown them in the blue depths of the lonely lochs, there were those who asserted solemnly that they had seen her with Robin Rennie in his boat. No wonder, therefore, that he came to be shunned by many of the villagers as an uncanny person with an evil eye. In disposition he was somewhat morose, and seemed to prefer solitude, but with these exceptions no one could say aught against him. He was kind to his mother and crippled brother, and they believed that he was the cleverest youth for many miles round, and that some day he would be a great man. But if the old people and the men looked upon him with suspicion, many of the young women uttered a silent sigh as he passed them. To all except one, however, he was utterly indifferent. But this one did not live in Helensburgh. She was the daughter of a rich merchant in Greenock. 2 or 3 nights a week Robin would sail his boat across the river, from Helensburgh to Greenock, and secretly meet with this young lady, so that it seemed as if she favoured his suit. Her name was Florence, and she enjoyed the reputation of being the belle of Greenock. It is difficult to say when they first met or how their acquaintance grew. The fact remains she was all unknown to her father and her brother, in the habit of meeting him and allowing him to talk love to her. Perhaps he had fascinated her with his evil eye, and she bore him no real love. At any rate, one night when he crossed the river and landed at the usual spot, where he had been in the habit of finding her waiting for him, instead of Florence there were 2 men. They at once announced themselves as the father and brother of Florence. They said she had confessed that she had been in the habit of granting him stolen interviews, thus disgracing her family. They had come now to caution him to return no more. Florence, they said, was not for the likes of him, and they had resolved that if he returned again they would kill him. Drawing himself up proudly, he told them with scorn in his voice, and with the fire of indignation flashing from his eyes, that he should return again and again, until he heard from the girl's own lips that she loved him not. This haughty and defiant answer aroused the father and son to fury, and each being armed with a stout stick, they suddenly fell upon him and beat him until he fell senseless to the ground. Thinking he was dead, and being frightened now lest the crime should be discovered, they lifted his body and carried it to the very edge of the water, so that when the tide rose and receded again, it would bear his corpse out to sea. They next set his boat adrift, knowing that if it was found, as it was almost sure to be, it would create an impression he had fallen out and been drowned. This done, they went away, believing that they had rid themselves forever of the troublesome lover. A few minutes later the moon came from behind a dense mass of black cloud and lighted the water up with the sheen of silver, and presently what seemed like a wreathed mist, but having a vague resemblance to a woman, floated gracefully along the silvery path of light. And as it came nearer the shore it developed into the perfect shape and form of the White Witch of the river. Truly she was a being of the most dazzling beauty, a beauty that was unearthly. Her eyes gleamed like stars on a frosty night. Her face, faultless in all its features, was white and cold like the face of a marble statue, and the deathly whiteness of the face was enhanced by her blue-black hair that hung like a great veil down her back to her feet. A robe of spotless white, that seemed to be woven from gossamer or mist, clung to her rounded limbs in the most graceful folds, while round her waist was a girdle of jewels that broke into 1,000 points of dazzling fire as the moonlight caught it. With a wave of her white arm she arrested the drifting boat, and then with another wave drew it towards the shore, and when its keel grated on the shingle, she slightly stooped and raised the insensible Robin as if he had only been a feather. Gently she placed him in his boat, and then, by some invisible power, the sail was raised. This done, the White Witch faded away, but a strange cloud of rosy luminous mist entirely enveloped the boat, which sped along before a strong wind, though the cloud of mist went with it. On went the boat with extraordinary speed, down the river first of all until it reached the mouth of the Holy Loch. Then the same invisible power that had guided it so far turned its prow almost due north, and with the luminous cloud still enveloping it, it sped up Loch Long to where Loch Goil joins it, and runs towards the west. Up Loch Goil went the boat, until it stranded at the head of the loch. Then the luminous cloud faded away. By and by the mountains began to stand out clear and distinct in the pearly light of the coming dawn, and gradually the purple that lay on mountain and water warmed to gold, until at last the weird landscape was ablaze with the brilliant fire of the rising sun, whose rays seemed to revive Robin Rennie, so that he sat up in his boat and gazed wonderingly around him. For some little time he appeared to be dazed, and he passed his hand repeatedly over his eyes, as if trying to clear his mental vision. Was it a dream, he muttered, as he began to recall the events of the preceding night. No, it could not be a dream, for he had an ugly wound in his temple where he had been struck, and almost every bone in his body ached. But how was it he had got to where he then found himself? It was a long way from Greenock, and he had not the slightest recollection of anything after Florence's father and brother attacked him. All after that was shrouded in the deepest mystery to him. But when he remembered how shamefully he had been treated, he became furious, and stepping on shore he wandered like one distraught into the gloomy glen that begins at the head of Loch Goil and runs west to Loch Fyne. Down this strange and desolate glen runs the Styx, and the wild rugged mountains, bleak and barren, rise up so high on either side as to involve the glen in almost constant gloom, while the only sound that breaks the silence is the hoarse cry of the ravens. It seemed to be a fitting place for Robin to give vent to his wrath, and, while the mists flying and rainy vapours call out shapes and phantoms from the crags and solid earth, to utter an oath that he would yet possess Florence and be revenged for the outrage upon him. For 3 days he remained in this weird solitude, not wishing to return to his people, showing traces of the outrage he had been subjected to. He lived as best he could on herbs and berries, and at night he crept for shelter under some jutting rock. During the dark hours, too, he heard strange sounds and witnessed strange sights, for the glen was a home of fleshless things. Blue lights flitted about, and every now and again, out of the blackness, were evoked nebulous forms that bore some resemblance to human beings. These forms seemed to be indulging in fantastic dances, forming chains, crossing and recrossing each other's path, bowing and receding, and then suddenly vanishing into the darkness from whence they had come. And there were sighings and moanings, and eldritch screams that woke the echoes with startling sharpness. All night long these uncanny sights and sounds went on, but the fleshless things slunk away when the morning light first beamed, and the only sounds heard then were the hoarse murmuring of the sticks and the raven's dismal croaking. At last Robert Rennie had so far recovered that he left this haunted spot, and sailing down the loch returned to his people. Many were the questions asked of him, and great was the wonderment expressed at his changed appearance, for his face looked careworn and haggard, and he had become more grave and morose. To the questions he made no answer. To the wonderment he was stolidly indifferent. For weeks he brooded over his wrongs, while the sullen gloom that seemed to have settled on his face repelled people from him, and he was shunned with fear. Scarcely a night passed now, no matter what the weather was, but he went out in his boat, and his neighbours whispered one to another, and shuddered while they avowed that the White Witch of the river was frequently sitting beside him as he sat at the tiller. Whatever the mystery was, Robert kept it to himself. The seal of silence was on his lips, but that he still thought of Florence was proved one day, as an old woman from the village was crossing to Greenock to transact some business. He took her aside, and putting a piece of gold in her hand, bade her deliver secretly a message to the girl. The message was in the form of a prayer and a threat. He prayed her to meet him at the old trysting place, for the last time, in order that he might bid her farewell forever. And she was to be informed that if she failed to come, a dreadful calamity would befall her and her people. Faithful to her trust, the old woman delivered the message, and Florence was evidently influenced by it, for after deep reflection she bade the messenger say she would keep the tryst. 2 nights later, Robert crossed the river to Greenock. It was a strange night, weird and gloomy. Great jagged black clouds filled the sky, and between the rents the moonlight sometimes streamed, calling into being gigantic and fantastic shadows that flitted over the river and the landscape. The wind blew coldly in from the sea, and it moaned like a thing in pain. The month was October. The sere leaves were dropping from the trees, and the trees themselves shivered and sobbed in the pitiless gale. A quarter of an hour after Robert had sprung on shore, Florence appeared. She was enveloped in a large cloak, and seemed to be excited and flurried. "What wish you with me?" she asked in a voice so stern and so unlike the loving tones that he was in the habit of hearing from her, that he started back, and exclaimed, "Surely this is not my Florence?" "No, not yours, though I once thought I was," she answered with a sigh. "But I have seen my error. You fascinated me. I mistook my feeling for love. I must have been mad, but I am mad no longer. We part and part forever. But I have come in deference to your wishes, and for the sake of what we have been to each other, to say farewell. My coming here is not unattended with risk, for I shudder to think what the consequences may be if my father and my brother discover my absence. So what you have to say you must say quickly, and let me go." He listened to her in gloomy silence. When she finished speaking, he asked her in a voice that seemed hollow and broken, "Is your love for me quite dead?" "I never had love for you," she answered. "I thought at the time it was love, but I know now I was mistaken." "You have been false to me then," he cried with passionate earnestness. You have lured me into a belief that you loved me, only to fling me off now with heartless cruelty. But it shall not be. We will not part. You shall be mine, even though we are wedded in death." With a shudder of fear she shrank from him, and at that moment sounds of hurrying and approaching footsteps were heard. Some instinct, perhaps, told her that her father and brother were coming to seek her. She turned as if she intended to run forward and meet them. But at the same instant Robert Rennie caught her in his powerful arms, and as she struggled to free herself, she uttered a shrill and a piercing scream that went echoing round the hills until it died down on the night wind with a melancholy wail. He carried her over the shingle to his boat, placed her in it, and pushing off sprang in himself, and hoisted the sail just as the father and brother appeared in sight. Florence made a frantic appeal to them to rescue her, and almost beside themselves they rushed along the shore, until they saw a fisherman's boat moored to a stake. Regardless of cold and wet, they swam out to it, and getting in, hoisted the sail and started in pursuit. But Benny's boat had got a long start, and now that strange luminous cloud seemed to envelop it again. The moonlight fell in broken bars across the dark water that was fretted into foaming wavelets by the salt sea wind. Fear had overcome Florence, and she had fallen in a faint at the bottom of the boat. Grim and silent, with face white as the moonbeam rays, Robert Rennie sat in the stern sheets holding the tiller and looking always ahead, never back. On went the pursued and the pursuer, the latter gaining slowly but surely, for the two men propelled with oars as well as a sail. The wind increased as they neared the mouth of the loch, and the boat sped on at fearful speed until they entered Loch Long. The pursuing boat was then within a few yards of the other. Florence still lay insensible, and Robert, with scarcely a sign of life, still sat grasping the tiller. Then, from out of the luminous cloud, two long arms seemed to stretch, and lifting the inanimate form of Florence, they raised her up and let her fall into the sea in front of the advancing boat. A cry of horror burst from the lips of father and son, and the hills seemed to echo and re-echo a wild and mocking peal of laughter. The two men stopped their boat, and seizing the clothes of the poor girl as they were expanded on the dark waters, they dragged her in. But she was cold and white as veined marble, and never would she be otherwise, for she was stone dead. Robert Rennie, who had never so much as looked round, still sat in the stern, and his boat tore on up the loch. But he was not alone. Another form sat beside him, a form of exquisite and unearthly beauty. It was the form of the White Witch of the river. Her arm was around his waist, her head was pillowed on his shoulder, and her night-black hair fell over him like a funeral pall. As the broken-hearted father and son bore back their dear, dead burden, the boat containing Rennie and his ghostly companion sped away up the loch until it was lost to sight. Then the gathering clouds in the sky grew denser, until the moonlight was blotted out. A sobbing rain fell, and the wind shrieked from the sea, and lashed the water into hissing foam, like the wind of death. When the morning broke the coast, people declared they had not experienced such a wild night for many and many a day. For many a long month, no tale nor tidings of Robert Rennie were ever heard. But when winter snows were melting before the genial breath of spring, a shepherd, searching for some strayed sheep in the gloomy recesses of the glen, found the skeleton of a man, and he recognized by the clothing that the dead man was Robert Rennie. And this was corroborated when a little later he found Robert Rennie's boat, crushed and broken on the Loch Coil Head shore, where it had been flung on that wild, weird night. The mystery surrounding the strange man's death was never cleared up, but even at the present day old wives, sitting over their winter fires, will tell you that he was lured into his destruction by the White Witch of the river. End of story 2.
Story 3 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Scott, Cheltenham, England. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story 3. The Blue Star. The following narrative is so strange and startling that possibly some of those who read it may feel a certain reserve about receiving as facts all the incidents as I have given them. Yet I solemnly asseverate that the whole story is true, although I make no attempt to offer an explanation of the weird and awful phenomena that presented themselves to me. Having a strong objection to anything like vagueness, I neither conceal names nor places, and, though for some time it was my misfortune to rest under a terrible suspicion, I shall make no attempt to disguise my identity. My name, therefore, is Francis Preston de la Motte. I am a member of the de la Mottes of Hampshire. My family are descendants of a very old Huguenot family, many of whom fell victims to the ruthless barbarity of the tyrant and bigot Francis I. Later still, when the royal butcher, the Duke of Guise, formed a triumvirate with Saint Andre and the Constable Montmorency to root out what he was pleased to term the heresy of the Huguenots, my direct ancestors, who had their estates in the Garonne, were amongst those who suffered most, and a broken and disheartened remnant fled to England, and ultimately established themselves in Hampshire. My family, since they rooted themselves in alien but hospitable soil, have been distinguished in literature, arts, and sciences. I was myself born in the academical town of Winchester, where my father owned a small estate, and was well known for his liberality, sound sense, and broad views. He died universally respected, leaving me a small patrimony and, as I believe, a fair share of his own good common sense. I may be pardoned for referring to these strictly personal matters, but what I wish to convey is that I am neither a visionary, a dreamer, nor a monomaniac. At least, I have never been accused of being the one or the other. That I have taken an interest and, as I venture to hope, an intelligent interest in many of the deeper mysteries of science I will not attempt to deny, and those things which fall into the category of psychological phenomena have always possessed a fascination for me. For many years before my father's death I had expressed a strong desire to travel, but he opposed this, saying that it was his earnest wish that my youth should be passed in the classical atmosphere of one of our great public schools. It thus came about that up to the time when I reached man's estate my life was a studious one, but my father's death released me, while the small fortune he was enabled to leave me gave me the chance of at last gratifying my craving to see the world. I made a tour through India, and had an opportunity of studying some of the occult mysteries of the higher sects of Brahmins, especially those relating to their power to hold converse with the dead, and of their no less wonderful power of themselves being able to simulate death for long periods at a time, during which they are enabled to see the spirits of the real dead. From India I passed to Russia, where I spent 2 years, and, having fair lingual powers, I acquired a good knowledge of the language, so far mastering its difficulties as to be able to read some of the most abstruse authors in the original. I had been on the move for some months when, towards the close of a terribly snowy day, I found myself in the little town of Sergievsky, about 50 miles to the north of Moscow, whither I was journeying. I had travelled east from St. Petersburg as far as Vologda. Thence I had turned my face south. My going to Sergievsky was a mere accident. I had been travelling for many hours in a mouldy, damp drosky, and was half frozen. My driver said that it would be dangerous to continue our journey on to Moscow during the darkness, for already there were signs of an increase in the snowstorm, and the road would be impassable. I therefore bade him make for the nearest trakteer, not at all sorry at the prospects of warmth and a good dinner. As the vehicle drew up at the door of the unpretentious inn, I hurried out as fast as the stiffened state of my limbs would allow me. Passing up a long passage, I entered a low-pitched room, the ceiling of which was crossed with massive smoke-blackened beams, from which depended the winter stock of wild-boar hams. As soon as I had been relieved of my heavy furs, I ordered a dish of lemoned tea by way of a preliminary, and then seated myself by the huge stove, and proceeded to take stock of the company present. There was a heavily bearded, black-visaged Jew who puffed huge volumes of smoke from a long wooden pipe, a fierce-looking Cossack soldier, a one-eyed pedlar, and a young man who, I ascertained, was a student at the College of Moscow, but had come to this town to visit an aunt, who was ill, and from whom he had expectations. The Jew and the Cossack gave me a surly greeting as I sat down. The one-eyed pedlar did not speak, though he gazed at me with his one eye suspiciously. But the young student put forth his hand, greeting me cheerily, and saying in fairly good English, "I think I am not in a mistake when I go to suppose that you from England come?" With a bow and a smile I answered him in Russian, telling him that his supposition was correct, but that I had for some time been travelling, and recently had made a most extensive tour through India. He at once manifested great interest in me, complimenting me on the way I spoke his language, and begging that I would relate my impressions of India, for it was a country which he had an unconquerable longing to see. "For," he added, "it is a land of mystery, a land where one may shake the hand and hold converse with those who have actually been with the dead in their home beyond the grave." I looked at him in surprise as he made this strange remark, and from that moment I fell under the spell of this being. Here is a word picture of his general appearance. He was a small, delicately built man, with hands and feet that would have done credit to a woman. His features were faultless, with an expression of dreaminess, though occasionally this gave way to a more spirituelle expression, but the dreaminess somehow seemed more natural to him. His skin was of a pure olive tint that flushed with a hectic red under the influence of excitement. The hue of his hair was raven black, and his eyes, wherein all the mystery lay, were like glittering jewels, and yet their light and fire flashed forth no warmth. They were cold, cold as steel, and in some indescribable way they gave you the impression that they were capable of reading your thoughts, of seeing the very secrets of your inner heart. His face altogether was a weird face, such a one as Fuseli or Wiertz would have loved to depict. It was capable of exerting a strange mesmeric influence, and I felt that the moment I gazed upon it. I am free to confess that I was influenced as I had never been influenced before, and I found myself studying him. I soon gathered that he belonged to a type of man differently organized to the generality of human beings. He was, in fact, a man I had long wished to meet, for he was one of a limited though daring class who, scoffing at the stereotyped dogmas of the schools, gave themselves up to speculative metaphysics and, striking into original paths of thought, endeavour to penetrate some of the mysteries of the forbidden doctrines of psychomancy. Before half an hour had passed we were chatting freely, as if we had been old acquaintances. He had been quick to gather that I took an interest in many of the subjects that fascinated him, and though he was a dreamer and enthusiast, which I was not, there was something in common between us, a something that drew us together, so that we were enabled to throw off all reserve and at once give free expression to our thoughts. As he had not dined, I begged him to do me the honour of joining me in the dinner I had ordered, and which the landlord at that moment announced as being ready. He bowed gracefully, saying it would give him great pleasure to do so, although he was a wretched eater. We exchanged cards, and I learned that his name was Ivan Vambery, and during dinner he informed me that he had for a long time been studying medicine, but had devoted much of his spare time to the investigation of spiritualism, animal magnetism, electrobiology, and the truly remarkable phenomena that are exhibited by hypnotic subjects. "And do you know, my friend," he exclaimed in a half-serious, half-joking tone, "in the course of my studies in anatomy I have frequently endeavoured to find the soul?" "And, of course, you haven't succeeded in your quest?" "Not exactly as the common herd would understand it," he answered, with a deep seriousness now. "For our wretched bodies, being cold in death, can offer us nothing but a complicated network of nerves, sinews, and muscles that quickly resolve themselves into revolting putridity. No, we must look elsewhere for the soul. We must train our eyes to pierce that mystic veil which separates the known from the unknown." "And have you succeeded in doing that?" I ventured to inquire. He paused for some moments before he answered, and during the pause his keen, glittering eyes were fixed upon me. Then slowly he answered, "I have, and I have seen things such as few mortal men are permitted to see and live." I could not suppress a slight shudder, for his tone was so sepulchral, his manner so strange. He seemed like one who was verily speaking from the world of shadows. He quickly recovered himself, however, and expressed great delight when I told him I took an interest in the occult wonders of the spirit world. It is true I had never gone as deeply into the matter as he had done, but still the subject had a fascination for me, and I said he would find me a diligent student if he had aught to teach. Dinner ended, we smoked a cigar, and then, as the hour was getting late, he bade me good night, but gave me a pressing invitation to visit him at his lodgings on the morrow. I don't know how it was, but all night long his strange face, with its glittering eyes, was before me, so that, notwithstanding I was worn out with fatigue, I could not sleep. I was troubled in an unaccountable manner, troubled as I had never been before, and yet I could not for the life of me have told what I was troubled about. But I know now, alas, that it was the coming of the shadow which since then has never left me. There was closing about me then, though I knew it not at the time, the gloaming of life's night, even before the noon of my existence had been reached. What I mean by that is, that with that night there passed from me all my youth, and henceforth I was to be as one who had grown old before his time. Such a nameless fear, a nervous disquietude took hold of me, that in the solitude of my chamber I vowed to leave the town with the first dawn of day. But I might just as well have tried to fly. That man had fascinated me, had thrown a spell about me, and so I was at his chambers at the appointed hour. Why did I go? I cannot tell. Call it weakness if you like, but a power that has no name drew me there. As his friends were well off and his allowance was liberal, he was enabled to study his tastes in every way. I found him occupying luxurious apartments, and as, by his aunt's request, he was going to make a stay of some months in the town, he had surrounded himself with a choice collection of books, and his library contained rare works on transmigration, ethics, hypnotism, magnetism, and so on. The walls of his sitting room were hung with strange drawings of ghostly subjects. Many of them, he assured me, had been done by spirits from the unseen world. At one end of this apartment was a heavy black velvet curtain, which I subsequently learned screened a small laboratory, for, as he informed me, he took a great interest in chemical experiments. Ivan Vambery received me with great cordiality. When I entered he was attired in a long fur robe, and wore a smoking cap trimmed with sable, which served to give his pale face a ghastly appearance. Without preliminary, he commenced at once to converse upon his favourite topics, and though I shuddered at his daring flights into the region of speculation, I experienced a sense of that fascinating pleasure one feels on witnessing the perilous and dangerous feats of a trapezist. When I arrived in the town, it was my intention to continue my journey the following day, but under the influence of this remarkable man I found my stay stretching into months, and still I could not go. My intimacy with Ivan ripened into warm and close friendship, and he told me much of his past history. So absorbed did we become in the investigation of psychological phenomena that he neglected his studies, while I was all forgetful that I had friends and ties in other parts of the world. It did not take me long to discover that Ivan was a peculiarly excitable man. He seemed to be merely a bunch of nerves that were at times affected by the shutting of a door, a puff of wind, or the passing of a vehicle, even the falling of a pin. Some people might have called him unpractical and theorist. Perhaps he was a little of both, but so assuredly he was an earnest and an honest man who sought for truth in those dark places where most men fear to tread. He had a habit of saying that nature was jealous of her secrets and her mysteries, and would only yield them to him who followed her into the dark byways where the common herd never ventured. His enthusiastic researches, however, I saw with alarm, were telling upon his health, and day by day he seemed to grow weaker, so that I begged him to desist and travel for a short while, but he was obstinate and refused. We had for a considerable time been engaged in an experiment that must be nameless, but it was as daring as it was awful, and he insisted in carrying this experiment to a successful issue, or proving beyond the possibility of doubt that it was useless. One night, or rather early morning, for it was past midnight, we sat together in his room. It was bitterly cold without, and the wind wailed like a thing in pain. A large log smouldered on the hearthstone, and a shaded lamp threw a soft and mellow light over the floor, but left the upper part of the room in semi-darkness. For some time we had been sitting silently, while the only external sounds that came to us were that weird wailing of the wind and the slow and measured ticking of a clock. I had noticed with alarm the unusual ghastliness of my friend's face. It was almost as if his soul had gone out of him, and an animated corpse sat in his place. There was a lividness about the face that was appalling, while his eyes were so lustrous and metallic in appearance as to seem unnatural. Unable longer to control myself, I exclaimed, "Ivan, you are ill!" "Hush!" he hissed, and his voice was like one who spoke from the tomb. "Hush!" he repeated. "I feel that we have not worked for nothing. See, there, look!" he almost screamed, as he pointed one of his long white fingers towards the door. I turned my eyes and saw the door slowly open. Not a sound came from it, although it was a massive door. Gradually it turned upon its hinges until it revealed the abysmal blackness of the great hall, and out of that blackness came a ghostly sigh. I was spellbound, fascinated, and dare not turn my eyes away. I knew, however, that Ivan was on his knees by my side, grasping my wrist with a grip of steel, and bringing his cold lips to my ear, he whispered, "Speak not, move not, lest you break the spell." But I could not have spoken, even had I been inclined. My tongue seemed glued to the roof of my mouth. Nor do I think I could have moved, for a spell was on me. Then from out the darkness I saw a star, a pale blue star, evolved. It floated into the room, and the door closed as slowly, silently, and ghostly as it had opened. I was conscious then that my friend had fallen forward on his face, and with a suppressed cry I broke the awful spell that had bound me, and, stooping down, raised him up. He had not swooned, as I thought, and he greeted me with a sad smile. "It is nothing," he said faintly, as I helped him to his chair. "I have been a little excited, and am weak, but shall be better directly. Give me a petit verre. That will revive me." I poured out a small glass of brandy, and he drank it. Then I took some myself, for my nerves were unstrung, and though I was deadly cold, perspiration was streaming down my face and neck. Under the influence of the liquor, Ivan's strength returned, and the hectic flush lessened the ghastly appearance of his ashen face. "You saw it?" he asked at last, in hoarse tones. "Yes." "Tell me what you saw," he demanded quickly and with nervous agitation. "I saw the door open, and I saw a blue star float in." "And what did you hear?" "A sigh, an audible sigh," I answered. "My doubts end, my scepticism is removed," he exclaimed, as he rubbed his hands excitedly together. I was puzzled to altogether understand his meaning, and I suppose I expressed this in my face, for he said, "I am talking riddles to you, perhaps, but listen and I'll explain. I have told you many things about myself, but there is one thing I have not told you. Years ago I loved, and she whom I loved was pure as the unsullied snow, and as beautiful as the Madonnas of some of the old painters. Ah, how I loved her, and how she loved me! But soon a hideous disease fastened upon her, and when she lay dying I cursed all things. She bade me seek consolation in prayer, but I laughed the idea to scorn. Then, with unspeakable gentleness, she chided me, and said we should meet in a better world, but I still scoffed. Turning her dying eyes upon me, she said with an angelic smile, "You are wrong, Ivan, and I will return to you to prove you so." They were her last words, and while they still trembled on her lips, she died. In these few brief sentences he at once gave me the key to much that had been obscure, that is, obscure to me, and I now understood the strong incentive he had for trying to divine the hidden mysteries of the spirit world. As he was now thoroughly exhausted, I persuaded him to retire, and this he consented to do, after exacting a promise from me that I would join him the following night in endeavouring to get some further manifestations. In accordance with this promise I found myself with him once again, but I was struck, and painfully so, by his altered appearance. The chalky whiteness of his face was emphasized by heavy black shadows under the eyes. He was feeble, too, so that he tottered when he walked. I urged upon him the desirability of having medical advice, but he flouted the very idea. He said that he was jaded with working in his laboratory all day, but it was nothing more serious than that. And he added that he had a presentiment something remarkable would happen before the night had grown old. For an hour or so we sat and talked, our subjects of conversation being metaphysical and recondite. Midnight sounded from the old belfry tower, and the brazen dong of the bell came like a shudder through the air. As the last stroke died away in a quivering groan, Ivan rose and said in a low voice and with an air of mystery, "The time has come." On the table he placed a silver dish half filled with spirits of wine, and applying a match there instantly shot up a pale blue lambent flame. He had previously pulled a screen before the fire, though very little glow came from the smouldering ashes. He now turned down the lamp, so that the darkness was only relieved by the burning spirits. I trembled with suppressed excitement, but I remained silent, watching with strained eyes every movement of my friend. I saw him take from his pocket a small box, and slowly and deliberately sprinkle some powder from the box onto the chafing dish, and instantly there arose a dense, aromatic, luminous vapour that spread itself throughout the room, producing on me, if not on Ivan, a delicious sense of dreamy languor. Suddenly he seized my hand excitedly, and in a hoarse whisper cried, "Look there!" He pointed to the velvet curtains which screened his laboratory. Towards them I now turned my eyes, and they were riveted there with fascination, if not with horror, by what they beheld. Standing out distinctly against the darkness of the velvet was a mass of waving nebulous light that gradually defined itself as a blue star. Then this star expanded and grew until slowly it assumed a human shape, the shape and features of a young woman of transcendental beauty, but with a look of ineffable sorrow on her young face. Alas, why should it have been sorrow instead of joy? I felt Ivan's grasp tighten on my arm, and in strange, hollow tones he spoke in my ear, "Swear to me by all you hold sacred that if I die tonight you will continue the experiments, and in the interests of science you will endeavour to place yourself en rapport with my disembodied spirit." I turned and looked at him, and shrank away with horror at the ghastliness of his face. Filled with terror, I half rose, intending to summon assistance, but he forced me back into my seat again, and said in the same hollow voice, a voice that had no timbre, no resonance in it. It was a voice not of life but death. "As you love me, as you have an immortal soul, do not move, but swear that you will do what I request." Wishing to pacify and calm him, I promised that I would. "But swear it on your soul," he said. "I swear it on my soul," I answered with a shiver. "Remember," he added with awful solemnity, "the witness to your oath is a spirit from the other world." Again I shuddered, and at that moment I saw the spirit figure slowly raise her white arm and point upward. Then she advanced to Ivan and placed her hand on his shoulder, and at that moment there came to me intuitively the knowledge of why the look of ineffable sadness shrouded that face of unearthly beauty. A spell was upon me, so that I could neither cry out nor move, beyond turning slightly to look at Ivan. At the touch of the spirit he seemed to be suddenly seized with violent convulsions. The sickly greenish hue of his face deepened. He turned his glowing eyes upon me, then their light suddenly went out, and they were dull, grey, expressionless orbs. He gave a gasp. His head sank on his breast. He slid to the floor and was dead. At that instant the spirit figure lost its outline and identity with the human form, became a mass of nebulous light again that slowly vanished. As it did so, a voice solemn and awful sounded through the room and said, "Remember your oath!" In a few minutes the spell of a strange fascination that had bound me and made me dumb was broken, and I uttered a cry of anguish, a cry that was wrung from me by almost more than mortal suffering. In my excitement I pulled the bell cord violently and, with a crash and a clang, alarmed the household. but nothing could be done. Ivan Vambery was too surely dead. The event caused immense excitement in the town, and I was accused of having been instrumental in bringing about his death, and notwithstanding that a post-mortem examination revealed that he had died from excitement acting on a weak heart, I was thrown into prison, for a suspect in Russia is shown no mercy by the iniquitous law. For a whole year I languished, and when I asked why I was detained, I was told that it was because evidence might yet be forthcoming that I had murdered my friend. At the end of the year, however, I was set at liberty, and lost no time in leaving the wretched country. I travelled all over the continent, scarcely staying 2 days in one place. But my dear Ivan's dying look and the terrible warning voice never left me. Neither travel nor excitement could make me forget them. I grew morbid, melancholy, and ill. My doctors prescribed change of air and scene, but I laughed at them, for they were utterly ignorant of the disease from which I suffered. Many a time I resolved to make those tests that Ivan and I had been in the habit of making when we wanted spiritual manifestations, but each time my courage failed me, and still the voice sighed in my ear, "Remember your vow." I had now settled down in London, and, unable longer to endure the fearful state of mind, I determined at all hazards to try and call up the spirit of the dead Ivan. It was a terribly stormy night when I prepared to put my resolution into practice. The wind fairly shrieked, and the rain dashed violently against my window. I drew my chair to the table and put the lamp out. The fire in the grate had burnt to a dull red. The clock on my chimney-piece marked 11. For an hour I sat, gradually bringing myself into the proper state to receive spiritual manifestations. The glow of the fire had faded, and inky darkness filled the room. The silence was deathlike, save that I heard my heart beat. I felt ill, and yet the old horrible fascination kept me at the table. I concentrated my thoughts on Ivan. I desired intensely that his spirit should visit me if it were possible. I silently called him, as it were, from the depths of my being, and the more I longed to have my desire gratified, the weaker I grew. At last I would have risen and fled, but could not. I was bound there, chained by invisible chains that would not break and set me free. Half after midnight chimed by the clock. Then I became conscious of a presence. It presented no shape to the eye, but I knew I was not alone. Almost involuntarily my lips unclosed, and like a mechanical figure I whispered, "Ivan Vambery, are you here?" A cold wind swept across my face, and I interpreted that as a sign in the affirmative. Then a chill foreboding seized upon me, a foreboding of what I know not. I was the only living thing in the room, and the dead could not harm me. Why then did I fear? Again I answer, I know not, but I experienced that unutterable terror which men experience when they know that between them and Sheol there is, as it were, but a curtain of air. Gradually, as I peered into the darkness, there became visible to my aching eyes a small pale blue light, and as I watched it, its outer edges clearly defined themselves into the 5 radii of a star, and in the centre of that star I saw the livid face and glittering eyes of Ivan Vambery. I have a recollection that at the same moment the timepiece proclaimed the hour of 1, not with the usual melodious tinkle, but with a stroke that was like the clanging of the huge clapper of an iron bell. Then the star faded, and a blank occurred. When I awoke from my sleep or swoon, whichever it was, The sunlight was streaming in through my window, for the storm had passed. I felt ill, and I knew by a strange intuition that for me peace had fled for ever. So the years have rolled on, but since that terrible night I have been haunted by the appearance of that star, blue and quivering, and in its centre the awful face of the dead Ivan is immovably fixed. I have travelled from city to city, from country to country, but cannot escape my fate. In the crowded ballroom or the busy street, in the sanctuary of the church or the solitude of my chamber, that blue star, framing the ghastly face, gleams upon me, and so it will ever gleam until the corruptible and incorruptible are separated, and Psyche, freed from her temple, shall soar to the mystic region that is wisely veiled from the eyes of all save the most daring and peculiarly constituted men. End of Story 3.